Translation and purport by Sri Prabhupada. A brahmachari, or one who has thus not accepted the grihastha ashram, family life, must rigidly avoid talking with women or about women, for the senses are so powerful that they may agitate even the mind of a sannyasi, a member of the renounced order of life. Purport. Brahmacharya essentially means the vow not to marry, but to observe strict celibacy, brihat vrata. A brahmachari or sannyasi should avoid talking with women or reading literature concerning talks between man and woman. The injunction restricting association with women is the basic principle of spiritual life. Associating or talking with women is never advised in any of the Vedic literatures. The entire Vedic system teaches one to avoid sex life so that one may gradually progress from brahmacharya to grihastha, from grihastha to vanaprastha, and from vanaprastha to sannyas, and thus give up material enjoyment, which is the original cause of bondage to this material world. The word brihat vrata refers to one who has decided not to marry, or in other words, not to indulge in sex life throughout his entire life. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindubhyevacha Patithanam Bhavanibhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So a very warm welcome to all the assembly for today's class. When I first read this verse, I could not stop laughing, thinking that how unqualified technically I am to speak on such a verse. But I'm going to attempt to say a few words on this verse. One of the first things that hit my mind is the entire chapter is being spoken in such a way that society can advance itself while at the same time acknowledging and in fact recognizing the very reason for why the jiva soul inhibits and enters into the material world. And therefore injunctions are being placed on each of the varnas and ashrams by which one can avoid the inherent tendency to try to lord over material nature. Now in this assembly there are many devotees who are by far qualified than me in terms of experience and age to speak on such a verse, but some of the points that I wanted to make were the understanding of the object and the subject in this sentence. Because for one who hasn't read the previous verses, or maybe for one who hasn't read previous scriptures that discuss in detail about the psychology of a man and woman, and the position of a woman, especially in the Vedic culture, will seem and probably spontaneously accept that womanhood is the object that's attacking the subject. And therefore, one is by nature superior and one is by nature inferior. I'll let you decide who the object and the subject are in this verse. But definitely there's an attack upon manhood by women. And the object, womanhood, are, according to this verse, the cause of the fall down of the man. And therefore it's very, very natural, especially in the Western civilization, where actually there isn't a culture or an established philosophy that is universally accepted with regards to the nature and the position of womanhood. And therefore it's very important, I felt, to kind of describe or attempt to share some of those passages from the Vedas with regards to the position of a woman. Now, in this verse, in actuality, it is the opposite taking place. That it is not because of the nature of a woman that a man falls down, but actually it's because of the nature of a man that he falls down. And therefore in the Dharma Shastras, especially beginning with Manu, the reason why Manu is emphasized so much, and Prabhupada I also mentioned sometimes in his conversation how it's an authoritative Dharma Shastra, is because he is the current Prajapati and Lord of the present Kalpa. And previous to Manu, we have Yajnavalkya and Vyasa and even Vishnu Dharma Shastras. But in Manu Dharma Shastra it explains that a woman is so unbelievably pure that in the very same way that one performs archaman and takes a bath before performing deity worship, if one was to simply look at the face of a woman, one becomes internally and externally purified. That's the position that the Dharma Shastras begin from. And then it describes and how, whereas a man is slightly distant from the nature of spirituality and the transcendental realm, a woman is by nature spiritual. And therefore, when it comes to bhakti and devotional service, a woman's heart is much more tender and softer, whereas a man's is much more harder. A woman is able to take to spirituality much more faster and quicker than a man. And therefore, the Lord himself, he ordains so many, at least 15 types of purificatory rites to try to reform the dumb masculine gender. And for the female, there is no samskara. And therefore Dharma Shastras explain that a female actually only has one samskara, and that is the vivaha. Because each and every one of the samskaras do nothing other than give the male and female their respective duties and responsibilities. And because by nature, a woman is devotional. We're talking from a Dharma Shastra perspective. Or very much easily made devotional. Therefore, a woman only has to go through the vivaha samskara. During the other samskaras, just the physical object is being done. For example, giving the name for the namakarana, or giving the grain for the annaprashna, etc. But the vivaha is purely and only rules and regulations for the woman. And what does, during the vivaha samskara, the position of woman is described towards the end, wherein the brahmachari, who is now becoming a grihastha, takes her hand and vows to be married to her. And it describes, Samaraggi Shvashure Bhava Samaraggi Swashravam Bhava Nanandari Samaraggi Bhava Samaragya Devrishu. It says that in the same way that a man is a Raja, a woman is a Raggi. And it says, Samaraggi Shvashure Bhava, that may this bride be the lord of the husband's father. Samaraggi Shvashravam Bhava. And this is very controversial, especially if you're Indian. May the bride be the lord of the mother-in-law. Samaragi Nanandani Bhava, that may the bride be the lord and master of the husband's sisters. And then Adi Devrishu, that may the bride be the lord and master of the husband's brothers. So here we're trying to understand the position of womanhood, that actually it is very superior. And therefore successful grihastas are those grihastas from whose hand all monetary and expenditure and finances goes through the hands of a woman. Being the embodiment of Lakshmi, you get a better return. Much more better at spending and investments. Again, we're talking from the Vedic perspective. And therefore you find that the Shastra repeatedly describe that the gender of a woman is very superior. And therefore when the Lord Almighty, through Lord Brahma, devised the language of Sanskrit, whereas the male was given the name Prabhu, which according to the language of Sanskrit refers to the master, the word Bhu was added to describe the masculine gender, because the word Bhu means one who is inferior to the mother, because the word Bhu refers to Mother Earth. And therefore the only word that was isolated from the word Prabhu, which would be equally superior to the word for a man, was Matra, which means Supreme Mother. So therefore, by definition, Even the very word for a woman, matra, is much more superior than the word for a male, prabhu, because the word prabhu refers to somebody who is under the shelter of the Supreme Mother, Srimati Radhika, who is then personified and represented in this world in the form of the mother. So by definition and by understanding, the female is always considered to be a superior energy in the material world. And therefore within this verse, the brahmachari is being instructed in certain ways by which they can focus on purely the education of spirituality and, to note, even materiality as well. And therefore the spiritual master was also the material master, whereas the young child will remain in the home of the parents, because the parents will be qualified, both in spiritual and material subjects, learning domestic topics as well as topics of the Puranas and Itihasas. The male was sent to a Gurukul, or if the father was a Brahmana, remain in the house to study so many different sciences. And during the course of study, because the emphasis was to try to become culturally sound and spiritually moralistic and ethical, therefore the preservation of one's chastity was always emphasized to the brahmachari in such words. Therefore you find that this particular chapter, the Bhagavatam, is nothing other than certain extracts from Upanishads and Dharmashastras which lay out the rules for the brahmachari. If you were to go back just a few steps, because it's been at least 2 days now since the last class of the Bhagavatam was given, the speaker, the pravakta of this chapter, Narada Muni, who himself is a brahmachari, it's very important to note. He's explaining on how the brahmachari should practice completely controlling his senses, being submissive and have an attitude of friendship for the spiritual master. And with the great vow of the brahmachari, he should live at the Gurukul only for the benefit of the Guru. And then as soon as the premise for brahmacharya is described, then one by one, the various rules are described. And the very first rule actually is quite intrinsic, because you find that within all the Dharma Shastras, this rule is expounded. And it namely consists of meditation, as explained. Sayam, pratur, that morning and evening which covers the entire day. At both junctions of day and night, namely in the early morning and the evening, the brahmachari should be fully absorbed in the spiritual master, the fire, the sun god, and Lord Vishnu. By chanting the Gayatri mantra, he should worship them. Now the Gayatri mantra refers to any hymn in the Vedas which has 24 syllables within it. And the specific Gayatri mantra being mentioned here is Japan Brahma Samahitaha, the Brahma Gayatri. And the Brahma Gayatri is emphasized because the Brahma Gayatri is by intent allowing and empowering the brahmacharya to access the knowledge of the Vedas. And therefore the Brahma Gayatri is emphasized during the stage of brahmacharya. In the Brahma Gayatri, the student prays to Srimati Radhika, Bhargaha, Devasya, who is the supreme effulgence, the internal energy of Devasya, the possessive of Sri Krishna, the internal energy of Lord Krishna, that may you eliminate my knowledge. May you allow me to access Sri Krishna through his words. Because the brahmachari later on is considered to become the spiritual master through the ashram of sannyas. And therefore the Dharma Shastra explain, Athasya mata gayatri pita acharya uchyate, that for the brahmachari, the mother becomes the Vedas, or Mother Gayatri. And the father, the acharya. Pita acharya uchyate. And therefore the brahmachari is requested to illuminate his mind through the Brahma Gayatri, by which he can then become a representation of the Supreme Lord through his very words, the Vedas. And later on you find that the various paraphernalia of the brahmacharya are described. Now the reason why I'm going through this is because we will then make a similarity to the sannyas ashram and show how in fact the brahmachari ashram is nothing other than a preparation for the sannyas ashram, and therefore all the various items of paraphernalia given to the sannyas are equally given to the brahmacharya. Even though the brahmacharya may later on accept the grihastha ashram ultimately the law of detachment is being described. And because the brahmacharya has the option of procreating and bringing forth representations of the Lord in this world through the form of progeny, or has the option of educating progeny through the ashram of sannyas. Therefore, you find the brahmacharya and the sannyas ashram are actually non-different. Therefore, in the Vedas, if you especially go through Dharma Shastras or the Upanishads, you'll find that actually there are not many rules or regulations for the brahmacharya, because they are all preserved in the section for sannyas. Therefore, when Hanumanji asked Lord Ramchandra in the Muktika Upanishad, Dear Lord, there are so many Upanishads, hundreds of Upanishads there are, but could you please outline to me the primary Upanishads? Lord Ram then gave a list of 108. And therefore it became so popular that people actually assumed that there were 108 Upanishads, but in fact there are many, many, many more Upanishads. And one of the most greatest Upanishads, the Chaitanya Upanishads, falls outside of the scope of the 108 Upanishads, just to describe that there are many, many other Upanishads. And therefore in this verse, Mekhala, that a straw belt is given to the brahmacharya, and within the Upanayana Samskara, which makes the brahmachari initiated into the vow of brahmacharya, the Mekhala, or in other words, the Monji Bandhanam, represents the tying of the three Vedas around the waist of the brahmacharya. Sometimes brahmacharyas, according to their means, may not have even any money to procure a dhoti or chadar, and therefore a belt consisting of kusha grass, the grass from which, when Lord Varaha shook his body during the fight with Hiranyakashipu, from his bodily hairs that fell into the ground, kusha grass was grown. And this kusha grass is wrapped around the waist of the brahmacharya by the spiritual master to remind him of detachment, to remind him to completely take the shelter of material nature. And therefore material nature becomes one's mother for the brahmacharya. And we all know that at the later stages of the Gambara, the clouds become the cloth of the brahmacharya. And the Monji Bandhanam, or the tying of the straw, reminds the brahmacharya that in the very same way the torso and the spine keeps together the human being, similarly the Monji, or the tying of the triple Vedas around the waist of the brahmacharya, should become the foundation of his life. And this is the only thing that really is making one stand in life, and therefore the Monji Bandhanam is done. And then dressed with deerskin. Deerskin is used to symbolize to a brahmacharya that one should remain mauna. Mauna in the sense of, and as Rupa Goswami explains repeatedly in Upadesha Amrita and other texts that he wrote, that one should refrain from speaking about material or gossip-related subjects, and therefore one should perpetually just meditate upon the Lord. And therefore the deerskin is used to symbolize that, because the deerskin allows one, especially in the previous ages, to keep away insects and other types of species of life which can cause harm or even death to the brahmacharya who is outside meditating. Because the smell of deerskin allows scorpions and serpents to remain at bay. And therefore matted hair, in fact, you find in Dharma Shastras, and again, I'm just speaking from the Vedic perspective, not the perspective that we follow in a particular institution. And maybe we can also get some inspiration from this and see what's relevant. But matted hair, why is matted hair described? The brahmacharya is advised to refrain from anointing oneself with perfume, combing one's hair, avoid wearing garlands, avoid wearing even shoes, even an umbrella, and therefore the growth of hair, to avoid even cutting one's hair. And the reason why is because to give the brahmachari the impression that you should remain as simple as possible. And in fact, if possible, unattractive. Because that would also keep away the tendencies to move on from the brahmacharya ashram immaturely. Because it's very easy for one to say, let's give up renunciation. Because remember, one has to understand that the renunciation that a sannyasi goes through, a brahmacharya is going through at such a young age, and therefore such regulations are given for a brahmacharya to remain as much as possible unattractive to the opposite sex. And possibly in himself feel, actually, there's no point. Let's just keep on the life of studentship. And then at the age of at least 25, when the brahmacharya has graduated for samavartana samskara, the brahmacharya becomes a snatak. Snatak means one who has a bath for the first time. Now this is not just a normal bath. Of course, it is just a normal bath as well, but it's to describe to the brahmacharya that actually, you see, you're having a bath, and now you're going to start to become clean, and therefore the spiritual master and the other brahmacharyas sprinkle sacred water over the brahmacharya, thus making him a snataka, and then he begins. Here are your first shoes. Here is your umbrella. Here is your nail clipper. Here is your hat. Here is your earrings, etc., etc. And the brahmacharya now begins to, become slightly attractive. Because now why? The snataka becomes a grihastha. But it's very important to note that all of the elements of attraction, wearing perfume, etc., are done in such a way that the mind of the brahmacharya is already extremely renounced. And therefore, technically, there is no question of a fall down for brahmacharya. And therefore, when the brahmacharya becomes a grihastha, sakha sapatapati bhava, sakyam te gameyam, sakyam te amayoshya, sakyam maya yoshtyaha. The Samaveda mantra Brahmanam explains that the brahmacharya only becomes the best friend of his wife. Not really the husband. He becomes a sakha, an advisor, somebody who he engages in devotional service with. Now, best friends don't really marry. Otherwise we have a problem. I won't say what. Because nowadays it's really not a problem. It's accepted in some circles. But therefore even the male and female are remaining as best friends. And therefore you find later on, within this chapter, the brahmachari is also given a danda. And according to one's varna, the danda extends to the chin, or to the nose, or to the hairline, for the Vaishya, Kshatriya, and Brahmana varna respectively. And the danda is given, because the very word danda means sentencing. Sentencing a person is the word danda. If you perform a offense, you're given a danda. Now, not a stick. You're given a sentence. And the carrier of a danda is a person who is now authorized to sentence individuals who are deviating from the path of Krishna. And the brahmachari and the sannyasi are given that authority, that they can now correct and purify and reform society. And therefore when one sees a danda, they remember, here is God coming in the form of his devotee to correct and help society. And therefore the danda is given. And the brahmacharya also receives the danda. Now in this way, I'm sure you're understanding that both of these two ashrams, the sannyasi and the brahmacharya, are actually one and the same. The only difference is that the brahmacharya is allowed to take the grihastha ashram, and whereas the sannyas traditionally actually becomes materially dead. And therefore, amongst the 108 Upanishads, at least 23 Upanishads are dedicated to the sannyasa ashram, such as the Paramahamsa Upanishad, the Bharvachakacharya Upanishad, and the Sannyasa Upanishad. And in one such Upanishad, especially the Yajnavalkya Upanishad, Yajnavalkya himself, he has a conversation with Maharaj Janaka, Vaidehi. Now it's very important because Yajnavalkya is such a special person that he describes the quality. Now again, we speak from the Vedic perspective. So the Vedic perspective is where the environment and general society were all universally educated in a very certain etiquette. And therefore you find that in the Paramahamsa Upanishad, it's already described that actually when one takes the vow of sannyas, the entire universe becomes instrumental in helping that person in their vows. It's really important because it actually says that amongst the 6 offenders, one of the offenders is the human being who actually does not help the individual who has taken the sannyasa ashram. You can read this actually, it's described so beautifully. And therefore, in the sannyasa ashram, when a sannyasi goes around preaching, you find that the entire universe, at least our planet, are helping the sannyas in its ashram. And during the brahmacharya stage, you find that the individual is asked to practice the regulations of sannyas. So that number one, the brahmachari is ready to take sannyas. And number two, if he holds on to that ashram because he feels that he needs to be a part of society, and as we explained earlier, to bring forth generations of devotees in this world, it is only done temporarily. And therefore in the Vedic culture, every grahastha took sannyas. It wasn't actually a matter of whether one's pure or impure. It was just for one's spiritual well-being, that one now officially retires. Therefore you find in the material world, the general Vedic culture still actually exists. Therefore everybody goes through retirement. Even if you don't want to go for retirement, the law of material nature and the governments around you and taxes everybody else, they push you to retirement. You need to retire. And if they don't push you, your family will, because you'll realize, I need a break from the children, etc. But the brahmacharya was always prepared for sannyas. And therefore you find in India, where the Vedic culture was more some practice and preached, in some families, even to this day, you're censored from society if after marriage you don't take sannyas. You've completely destroyed our ancestral line. You are barred from marriages, from family gatherings. Take away our surname. How can you, after becoming a grahastha, not take sannyas? This is just, you're just in Maya. I can't believe it. So, families actually exist, where the individual is being pushed in that direction. But how beautiful it is that at the stage of sannyas, as described in the Vedic culture, because the individual goes through both the renounce stage during its teenage years, the most powerful, aggressive, it's explained, Vyagra, the years of a tiger, the eating and experience in the material world, having practiced renunciation at that stage of life, and then having practiced grihastha, the stage of life when one is really involved in the material world and actually one experiences the material world so much so that they look forward to retiring. Sri Radha Raman ki jai, Sri Radha Raman ki jai, Sri Radha ki jai. And therefore, having gone through the brahmacharya and through the grihastha ashram, then you find that the sannyasa Upanishads, especially Yajnavalkya, he describes then that a sannyasi is more likely to not give up his vows. Now sometimes definitely there were offenses being made, and therefore the personality Yajnavalkya in the 12th canto Srimad Bhagavatam, despite being the foremost of the brahmachari disciples of his spiritual master, the great Vaishampayana, at one day when they were invited to a Shraddha ceremony, and Yajnavalkya discussed with Vaishampayana who should become the adhikaris of the Shraddha ceremony, all Yajnavalkya said to his spiritual master was, my God brothers, they're not really qualified to become Shraddha Patras. Because you see, in Shraddha, one becomes so pure that when one eats the morsels of food grains, that food is accepted by the individual on behalf of God. And when on behalf of God the individual accepts the food, that benefit is given to the departed soul. And I think my God brothers are not ready yet to become adhikaris of the Shraddha Patra. Immediately Vaishampayana, as the 12th canto describes, was so upset with Yajnavalkya that he said to him, not only do I reject you as my disciple, not only do I kick you out of the temple and the ashram for considering your God brothers who are younger to you in age, unqualified, because you even felt them to be unqualified, I'm asking you to vomit all of the Vedic mantras that I taught you. All of the instructions that you heard through your ears and it went into your heart, regurgitate from your heart and your stomach and your life and soul and spit it out from your mouth in the form of vomit. I don't want anything to do with you. That's what Vaishampayana said to Yajnavalkya. and Yajnavalkya being the ardent disciple of Vaishnampayana. Now you see, this is a really important point to make, because what did Yajnavalkya do? Tathastu. He agreed, Om Swasti. And immediately, Yajnavalkya started to vamana. He started to vomit out the mantras. And as soon as those mantras were vomited from the mouth of Yajnavalkya, his younger godbrothers all became little birds, called in Sanskrit Taittiriya, which in English is called partridges. The partridge in a pear tree? One of those. And they became birds. And when they became birds, they began to eat the vomit of their senior godbrother. Now, as a human being, to eat vomit, one becomes impure. You got to change your shikha, you got to change your thread, you got to throw yourself in the Ganga. But as birds, it's okay to do that. And therefore they became birds. And in the form of partridges, they began to eat the mantras which were vomited out by Yajnavalkya. Now the spiritual master, at the same time, reprimanded his disciple to say that this is offensive. You can't speak about your godbrothers like this, and therefore get out. But at the same time, he realized that Yajnavalkya had become so advanced as a brahmacharya that actually only by his mercy are the other brahmacharyas going to benefit and advance. Therefore, if I get him to vomit out all of his mantras, then the other younger godbrothers, when they eat those mantras in the form of vomit, they'll become advanced and equal to Yajnavalkya. And Yajnavalkya knew this. And having vomited out all of the mantras of the, I'll explain later on, but for now, the Yajurveda, the godbrothers came, ate the vomit, had the mantras, and they then became advanced, qualified for the Shradha. But Yajnavalkya, knowing the intent of his spiritual master, left the ashram, having given his learning and knowledge to his godbrothers, having become emptied of all knowledge, he then began the worship of Shri Krishna, and he prayed, as the Bhagavatam explains, that my dear Lord Krishna, in the form of the sun, the personality who every day, as the Bhagavatam describes, morning and evening, have continuously meditated upon, through the Brahma Gayatri, may you appear to me and teach me words of the Yajurveda which are unknown to my spiritual master and to my godbrothers. Now, on one hand, it's a show of ego, because now he wants something extra, unknown to the rest of the world. But on the other hand, he's now preparing himself to once again perform devotional service, because what can an empty jug pour? And therefore, with Yajnavalkya once again fills himself with learning, he can then again serve as he had done previously. And therefore, Lord Krishna, through the agency of Surya, manifested himself in the beautiful form of a golden horse. Now, the horse is called Vaja. And through the form of the horse incarnation, this is not Hayagriva, by the way, Vaja Dev then began to speak aspects of the Yajurveda unknown to Yajnavalkya or even his spiritual master Vaishnampayana. And because he came from the form of the sun, the book which was given to Yajnavalkya became known as the Vajas Aneyi Samhita, or the bright Shukla Yajurveda. And the previous Veda of the Yajura was described to be the Krishna Yajurveda. And therefore, both became divided. And Yajnavalkya, despite now being kicked out of the ashram and being given a whole new set of hymns by the Lord himself, he then became an authority and not an outcast from the world. And therefore, when the Sannyasa Upanishads, Yajnavalkya and Janaka Maharaj are describing and discussing the ashram of sannyas. And 6 levels of sannyas are described: Kautichak, Bahudak, Parivichakacharya, Paramhamsa, and then the Dunitya, and then the Avaduta. And what's very interesting, while each of the 6 stages of sannyas are described by Yajnavalkya, who now becomes an authority, and is accepted universally as an authority despite the previous pastime, amongst many, many rules and regulations, the one which Yajnavalkya decides, coincidentally, to speak on, which differentiates each of the individuals in the 6 stages of sannyas, is food. And each stage of sannyas is where an individual is allowed to have more food than the previous. For example, with a kotichak, he stays in one village and he eats from one particular house. And then the bahudak stays in one village and eats from many houses or many individuals. So it's a good idea. You don't get indigestion, etc. The same kind of spices given to you, rather than different spices by different people, different recipes. And the Parivachakacharya, he then travels and he eats indiscriminately. And the Paramahamsa, is described when and whenever possible. And then the one just before, Avaduta, eats like a cow, just with his mouth, just mouthfuls. And the Avaduta eats like a python, that in small morsels and only to keep the body and soul together in very, very small degrees. The process of the sannyasa ashram being described through the eating of food is once again to remind the individual to become detached, at least in terms of food. And therefore you find that the sannyasa ashram and brahmacharya ashram, all they are doing, they're trying to explain to the jiva that one needs to become detached further and further. And the refraining of talking with women, I only have 5 minutes left, and that's very good because I can discuss this very limitedly. That on the stage of detachment, so that one doesn't aspire to then enter back either into the Grihastha ashram from the sannyasa ashram or as a brahmacharya leave one stage. Therefore, you'll read later on in this very chapter that the words are saying, okay, fine. If one has to integrate with society, even at the level of sannyas, it should be minimal conversations, minimal talk. Only because one may fall down from their vows. And it's not something which was never ever done. Therefore, you find even in the Vedic histories, great sages like Vishwamitra, who became the spiritual master of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Prabhupada describes, even he fell down when he came into touch with Menaka. But the difference here was that a fall down is not described to be one who is now completely kicked out and taken away from society. Instead, support structure is still given. And Vishwamitra is a very ideal example. That with a support structure, he then became once again so qualified that he became the spiritual master, even Lord Ramachandra. So within this chapter, when I read this chapter, number one, the position of a female is given to be one of superior nature. Number two, because of the dull nature of a male, therefore he is given so many rules and regulations, so many samskaras, and so many types of reformatory procedures by which one can remain as a student or after a student, a householder in renunciation. And therefore he is ready for the ashram of sannyasa when his duties are complete. And therefore the refraining or talking of interaction with a woman allows one to, because of the nature that they have, the fickle nature, and as we read in the very next verse, the nature of butter, to become very melted very, very easily. Therefore, those two ashrams are suggested to remain at bay. And interestingly, I think it was Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he describes on how for womanhood, her greatest quality is chastity. And whereas with the husband, chastity may not be able to be practiced in totality, because naturally living in the same house and there's familiarity, etc., etc. And as the great Vedic saying says, Ati parichayat avagya, familiarity breeds contempt. Therefore, at least the female is allowed to practice this great principle of chastity when in association with the brahmacharyas and the sannyas. But these two ashrams, individuals always see the female not as a person who can destroy the ashram that they're in, but a person of great respect. And it's amazing because these two ashrams, although they have this consciousness, the consciousness, because it's been given to the student at such a young age, it's very difficult to get rid of. And therefore the highest dues of renunciation are given to the brahmacharya. One final example, and I think for me it's one of the most beautiful examples of Lakshmana in the Ramayana. We all know that having finished his student life in the Gurukul of Vashishta, when Lakshmana became a Grihastha and he was sent to exile along with Lord Ramchandra, who he voluntarily accepted to go with Lord Ram and Sita to exile. When in the forest of Dandakaranya, Sita was taken, and Lord Ramchandra, by the will of Providence, found the ornaments of Mother Sita, Lord Ram asked Lakshmana for confirmation on whose ornaments these are. And Lakshmana replied, Naham janami keyure, Naham janami kundale, Nupare bijanami, Nityam charanabi vandanat. Lakshman said to Lord Ram that I do not recognize these earrings. I do not recognize these armlets. But I do recognize the toe rings because my eyes never once raised beyond the feet of Mother Sita. So, can you imagine? Even in this situation, Lakshman was not able to identify the ornaments on the upper form of Sita because of the great vows of renunciation, because of the great respect he had to the females. And without this culture, no matter who you are, because of the Western civilization is so powerful, it's quite apparent and it's quite inherent that anyone who reads such verses begins to disrespect the form of women because they feel it's an attack upon the ashram. But this is not the Vedic culture. This is not Vedic history. This is not Krishna's culture or respect or his understanding of way life should be. Therefore, it's very important that all of such verses are taken into context and one actually realizes who is the aggressor and who is the victim. And I'm hoping that through this small presentation, one realizes that the aggressor and the victim are somebody else who maybe the verse apparently gives us. Because the verse is just a single verse. It is just 32 syllables. And before the 32 syllables, there is so much culture and so much understanding that one has to have when seeing the context of, as we described at the very beginning, the object and the subject of the sentence. I thank you very much. Hare Krishna.